All right, today we're going to demystify one of the most popular methods out there in qualitative research, thematic analysis. Now, it's a really powerful way to find patterns in your data, but, its simplicity can be a little bit of a trap. Let's dig into why.
So, if you've ever found yourself staring at pages and pages of interview transcripts, or just a mountain of open-ended survey answers, you know the feeling, right? You've got all this rich, complex, kind of messy data. So how on earth do you turn all of that into clear, meaningful insights?
Well, that's usually where thematic analysis, or TA, makes its grand entrance. It seems so straightforward, so flexible, so accessible, and honestly, it is. But that's also where the danger is. A lot of people end up using TA in a really superficial way, kind of just scratching the surface and missing its depth, and that can lead to an analysis that just isn't as strong as it could be.
For this explainer, we're leaning on the work of the experts, Virginia Braun and Victoria Clarke. Their 2023 article is really foundational here. And their goal isn't to create a bunch of rigid rule followers. Not at all. It's to help all of us move toward what they call knowing practice.
So yeah, while TA is incredibly popular, using it well means you have to navigate a few common perils. Braun and Clarke point out several pitfalls that can really weaken our research. But by understanding them, we can seriously improve the quality of our work.
And look, the big goal here isn't to just blindly follow some six-step process you found online. It's about becoming a knowing researcher, someone who's really thoughtful, deliberate, and reflexive, someone who truly owns every single one of their analytical decisions.
Okay, so let's jump into the first major pitfall, and this one is a biggie. This idea that thematic analysis is just one single monolithic thing.
The reality is, there's no such thing as a single, standardized TA. So what does that mean? Well, Braun and Clarke really want us to think of it more like a family of methods. Each one has its own assumptions and its own goals. And just figuring out which family member you're working with, that's the first huge step toward good practice.
And that family really breaks down into two core philosophies. On one side, you've got what they call small q, or positivist TA. For this, think of the researcher as a descriptive scientist, where the goal is pure objectivity. The researcher is just a neutral instrument. But on the other side, there's big Q, or reflexive TA. Here, the researcher is more of an interpretive artist. The goal isn't objectivity, it's deep interpretation, and the researcher's own perspective is actually seen as a resource, not a problem to be eliminated.
So, here's the bottom line. You really can't be a descriptive scientist and an interpretive artist at the exact same time, not without a very clear reason. Just mashing up procedures from these two different philosophies creates what Braun and Clarke call methodological incoherence. It's kind of like trying to follow a recipe for a cake and a stew at the same time. The result is just a mess.
Okay, let's move on to the second pitfall. And this is probably the single most common mistake people make when they're trying to do that reflexive TA. It's all about what a theme actually is.
So, you have to ask yourself this question. When you create a theme, are you telling an interpretive story about a shared pattern of meaning in the data, or are you just summarizing what a bunch of people said about a topic? The difference is absolutely huge.
And this really shows the difference perfectly. A weak theme, which is really just a topic summary, might be called something like barriers to care. It's basically just a bucket you throw all the data about that topic into. But a strong, interpretive theme, well, that tells a story. Something like assessments as aversive gatekeeping. You see the difference? One is just a label. The other is an actual argument. It's an insight.
Here's a really good little test you can use. If you could have come up with your theme before you even started looking at the data, like maybe it was literally one of your interview questions, then it's probably just a topic summary. A real interpretive theme can only grow out of a deep, thoughtful engagement with your actual data set.
And this idea leads us right into our third and final pitfall for today, misunderstanding the researcher's own role in this whole process.
There's this really common idea that themes are just kind of sitting there in the data, just waiting to be discovered, that they'll just emerge if you stare at your transcripts long enough. But that idea is just fundamentally wrong.
This quote from Braun and Clarke's original 2006 paper says it all. They say that themes don't emerge from data like a fully grown Venus arising from the sea. It's such a brilliant image, right? It just shows how absurd it is to think that these complex themes are just these pre-existing things we simply find.
So owning your active role starts with the words you use. Try to avoid passive words like I identified, or we found, or themes were discovered. Instead, use active verbs like we generated, or I constructed, or we developed. This kind of language accurately shows that themes are the product of your active interpretive work as a researcher. So, after going through all these pitfalls, how do we put it all together? How do we actually move toward that ideal of becoming a knowing researcher?
Well, it all comes back to this idea. A knowing researcher is, number one, deliberative. They think carefully about every choice they make. They're also reflexive, constantly thinking about how their own biases and perspectives are shaping the analysis. And finally, they strive to own every single part of their research, from their philosophical starting point to their final interpretations.
So, what does this actually look like in practice? Well, here are 5 key steps. First, figure out your approach. Are you the scientist or the artist? Second, make sure your methods actually line up with that choice. Third, really push yourself beyond those simple topic summaries and develop rich interpretive stories. Fourth, use that active language to own your role in the analysis. And finally, make sure the quality standards you're using actually make sense for the approach you've chosen.
Look, the whole point of this explainer wasn't to give you some rigid checklist to follow. It was to get you thinking and to encourage a more deliberate way of doing research. So the final question really is for you. Thinking about everything we just covered, what is one concrete step you can take in your next project to become a more knowing researcher?